So there's three primary reasons that the awake person, the person who's authentically awake, right? And let's remember that awakening is not an experience, it's a paradigm shift, right? It's the shift into a different mode of being. And there may be experiential elements to that shift, but those, of course, fade away. But the paradigm shift does not if it's authentic. So, of course, it's the case that plenty of people don't realize that they're not actually awake, that they've simply had powerful awakening experiences and then conceptualized those experiences and then lived on the basis of those concepts. And they call that being awake. And that's very, very, very common. And it's just not actual awakeness. Now, having said that, it is a better way to live than many other ways, because again, you're living on the basis of concepts formulated on the basis of experiences of the true nature of reality. But you see, it's still different than living in the awakened paradigm in which you don't need any concepts or beliefs because you're actually existing in this different paradigm. You're seeing everything from this radically different point of view constantly without thought and before you ever have any thought about it, right? So you don't need to believe in non-duality or oneness or anything like that to exist in the awakened paradigm in which non-duality or oneness is as obvious as breathing, you know? So just making that distinction, because that's also poorly understood. Okay, but if we're talking about these folks who are actually in the awakened paradigm, as opposed to, you know, the simulation thereof I just referred to, then we do have to ask this question, like, why is it uncommonly the case that they are jerks when we might expect them to be, because of this fundamental freedom that characterizes the state and because of the persistence of negative thoughts, right? Again, there's three primary reasons that awake folks are generally lovely people, you know, or at least not jerks. So let's go over those three now. The first one is cultural, meaning to say, most people who, well, I don't even know if I can say most people, but a lot of people who awaken do so in the context of a spiritual tradition that first trains them in moral conduct. And the classic example, of course, is Buddhism, which is a path of awakening when properly taught, which it often isn't. But Buddhism trains its adherents very rigorously in moral conduct, and that forms habits of mind and body. And then when awakening occurs, habits persist. They just do, right? There's nothing about awakening that obliterates habitual thought or action. And there's nothing about awakening, by the way, that confers an automatic moral download. You know, you don't automatically get some kind of moral code along with awakening. Not at all. In fact, you realize that right and wrong, good and evil, or good and bad, that these are mental constructs, not features of reality per se. So, of course, it doesn't come with a moral download. Therefore, traditions like Buddhism and many others see that it's quite important to train people in moral conduct and the bases of moral conduct, meaning to say, understanding why it's important and beneficial prior to awakening. So it's beneficial programming, if you will. But the other two reasons are quite different, right? The other two reasons have to do with what happens after awakening. Okay, so integration of awakening is the process by which what you can perceive from the awakened point of view or within the awakened paradigm starts to influence the various sort of layers of the body-mind. That is to say, the body-mind starts to receive over time the imprint of what is realized in the awakened state. But the important thing here is this principle by which the awakening slowly integrates with all the layers of selfhood, if you want to call them that, the layers of the psyche, the layers of embodiment. That is an important part of the process, but some people do manage to avoid it, right? And if the context of someone's awakening was highly transcendentalist, then they might indeed subsequently avoid the process of integration. And it is a fairly natural process. So I think you have to have mental frames in place that inhibit integration for it to not happen on some level, right? But it can happen more slowly or more quickly. It can be more or less complete as well. When the body mind starts to receive the imprint, as it were, or the influence of that which is perceived in the awakened paradigm, there's a softening that happens, right? As the heart, as the emotional body it receives that influence, there's a softening that happens. This is the most natural thing in the world for somebody who's authentically awakened, that over time, there's increasing softness. And that goes in many levels, that there's a natural tendency towards compassion. That's part of the softness, right? Or empathy. One grips one's opinions less tightly. There's a softening around the holding of any kind of opinion or view. So such a person becomes less argumentative, although they might still argue for the fun of it, and that might be mistaken for really holding to their opinions strongly. But with that softness often comes a kind of lightness. But it's just much easier in this condition to sort of melt the heart, right? Like it's not that it's always constantly soft, right? But it's easier in this condition to notice when it's not quite as soft as it could be, and allow it to soften, and then experience some empathy for the other person or for oneself, and also be more free of judgment in this state of greater softness and openness and empathy. It's natural to be much less judgmental as well. But this is, again, something that's quite natural, but doesn't necessarily happen to everyone who awakens in the same degree. But then the third reason I wanted to cover is interesting because it doesn't require integration at all. It doesn't require this softening, and it's actually a function of clear seeing. So if the awakening is authentic, again, then part of what's clearly seen is that there's no actual real-world advantage to having more stuff, whether the stuff is experiences or praise, recognition, material objects, wealth, prosperity, sex, whatever. Part of what's seen in awakening is that you don't achieve fulfillment by accumulating pleasurable experiences. That's seen as clear as day. Maybe not in the very first stages of the awakening, but at some point it's certainly seen. So look how that changes your paradigm. If you see with indisputable clarity that there's no point to accumulating pleasurable experiences, you can enjoy pleasurable experiences. You can even pursue them if you want, for the same sort of reason that you might play a game with friends, just sort of for fun, to see what happens, right? But in the awakened state, you see clearly that fulfillment does not ever, for anyone, ever result from the accumulation of pleasurable experiences, right? So if that's the case, then you're not going to be willing to sort of step on the other guy to get what you think you want. Do you see what I mean? It really pulls the rug out from under this whole normal human project of fighting to be on top or make more money or have more praise and recognition, all of that just naturally falls away because you see that there's no actual point to it, right? And by the same token, you see that that fear-based activity, fear-based actions don't have any advantage either, right? That it's natural to feel fear about certain things, but there's no benefit whatsoever to sort of putting that fear in the driver's seat. And when that's seen clearly, it's much easier to simply feel the fear or whatever it is and not let it run the show, right? And so with this clear seeing, it's natural to not be a jerk. You see what I mean? Because people are jerky, or whatever other word you want to put in there, when they use and manipulate others for their own advantage, right? When they clamber over others, step on others for their own advantage, et cetera, et cetera. None of which is natural to do in the awake condition. Do you see the difference? It's not that the awake person is trying to be saintly. It's not that they're trying to be nice even, right? An awake person would have no motivation or reason to try to be nice. They're not trying to win approval or any of that stuff. And yet they might actually be a very kind person for the reasons that I've outlined, right? This softening in the energy body, this softening of the heart, which is very natural after the energy body receives the imprint of that awakened condition. And for the other reasons I've mentioned, right? Clear seeing that there's no point to angling for an advantage in a way that does a disservice to others. When a word receives a kind of positive valuation as something that people should be, then it becomes very hard for them to admit to the opposite. So if the word awake is sort of seen as denoting the desirable condition, then people will have a very hard time admitting that they're not awake. And that is, of course, nothing but ego. But apart from the ego part of the issue, I just want to highlight the fact that the word shouldn't really have that valuation, meaning to say, if awake is how we should be, then no, you haven't understood awakening, right? Because it is a state free from shoulds. So it's the ultimate irony to suggest that, people should be awake. That's not the case at all. There is no should in reality, okay? And awakeness is about reality as opposed to living in the mind world. But having said that, it's still, quite difficult for people to admit to not being awake. But it should be as clear and as simple as this. It's like, no matter how many great experiences you've had, if you're not living in the awake paradigm, if that's not your default state, which is not to say you don't have your moments of, losing sight of what's really true for a minute or whatever, but it's your default state. If you're actually awake, it's your default state, being in this paradigm that we don't have words for. So I always hesitate with whatever words are being used, that is really rare. It's very common to have awakening experiences. It's quite rare to actually shift into the paradigm where awakeness is your normal, natural default state. So there's no shame in admitting that that's not where you are. And even more important than that, when you admit that's not where you are, you can aspire to be there. And why would you aspire to be there if there's absolutely no should in reality? Well, simply because you feel this innate longing, this draw, this pull to know and be the truth of existence. Not because it makes you better in any way than anyone else, but you just feel that innate pull. And or you want to be of service to other beings. And you know that's much more possible from an awake paradigm. I could go on and on as usual, but I'll cut it off there and let this be your your contemplation for whatever, today, this week, this month, this year, whatever it turns into.